Good evening and welcome to Chicago Tonight. I'm Paris Schutz. Brandis Friedman has the evening off. On the show tonight,
we know that our work is certainly not done.
A budget and ethics package are at the top of Springfield's to-do list. We have a rundown of what else legislators have been up to.
We think we've hit the right note with this interim policy.
Breaking down the Chicago Police Department's interim foot pursuit policy and looking at its potential impact on the ground.
And a lot of people here also don't want to be erased.
We're live in Humboldt Park. We look at some community members' efforts to slow gentrification in the area.
Kelly's was a hip, kind of happening place, you know? It was just cool.
A new documentary about the Chicago nightclub Mr. Kelly's, which launched several legendary careers, airs tonight. We have a preview. And Jeffrey Bayer on the history and restoration of a well-known Chicago building in this week's Ask Jeffrey.
And Paris, as you mentioned, I'm in Humboldt Park on the northwest side, where I'll be reporting live as part of our Chicago Tonight in Your Neighborhood series. We'll hear about affordable housing for local artists, the challenges the pandemic has posed for teens, and how a holistic co-working space is fighting back against gentrification. But for now, back to you.
All right, Nick, a lot on the docket there, and we'll look forward to that in a bit. But first, some of today's top stories. Federal prosecutors announced a major drug bust today after a multi-year investigation. Illinois U.S. Attorney for the Northern District, John Lausch, announced charges against 17 people for allegedly attempting to distribute heroin and cocaine throughout Chicago. The sweeping investigation, dubbed Operation Tragic Blow, was conducted along with Federal Homeland Security Department and the Chicago Police Department. Lausch says the U.S. Department of Homeland Security and CPD relied on, quote, extensive undercover and covert surveillance operations to conduct the investigations during the probe.
Law enforcement seized multiple kilos of heroin and cocaine, including a 14-kilo cocaine seizure in the Belmont-Cragen neighborhood in Chicago, and a 2-kilo heroin seizure in Chicago's Buena Park neighborhood up on the north side.
And Illinois public health officials report more than 800 new COVID-19 cases in the last 24 hours, with 42 additional deaths. That makes for a statewide total of 1.379 million cases and 22,718 deaths. So far, more than 40% of the state's population has been fully vaccinated. And the big Memorial Day travel weekend is almost upon us, and now folks that hit the road can get vaccinated along the way. The state announces vaccination clinics at major travel stops like Chicago's Union Station and at travel centers along highways downstate in places like Mount Vernon, Effingham, Bloomington, and Pontiac. No appointments are necessary, and only those 18 and up are eligible. Well, there won't be any relaxing or unwinding this weekend for Illinois legislators. They're heading into the holiday weekend, as always, with a jam-packed to-do list, and they've got through Monday, Memorial Day, to get it all done. Amanda Vinicky is in Springfield and joins us now with more. Amanda, legislators have been meeting all week on any number of things. Where are things at?
Well, Paris, the big ticket items, those are still in the works. Ethics legislation, a major energy package, and we'll actually be talking later in the program with Governor J.B. Pritzker's lead negotiator on that, and also the budget. Illinois' budget picture is actually rosier than expected given the pandemic, with revenues coming in higher than fiscal forecasters had originally predicted, and then plus the state getting $7.5 billion from the federal government in COVID relief funding. Republican legislators say given that, there is no need for, have a piece of paper that's on the ground, but a whole package of $932 million annually in what the governor calls corporate loopholes. But Senator Jill Tracy, a Republican, says it wasn't all that long ago that the governor actually signed some of these corporate loopholes into law as part of a bipartisan infrastructure deal.
And ones that he championed around the state as essential job creation tools. Unfortunately, what he once viewed as valuable job creation incentives, he now calls loopholes in his effort to reverse his position. Let me be clear. Any tax increase as part of this year's budget must be off the table.
So now the fate of those taxes, here they are, got that paper. That is still unknown. Among them is one that regards private school scholarships. So private school administrators and parents are really fighting to keep in place the current tax credit that goes to donors for helping to fund these private school scholarships. Also wrestling over how to use that COVID relief money. You know, pretty much every interest, and there are plenty of them here at the Capitol, has a demand. Latino legislators say they want some of that money to be dedicated to immigration welcome centers and programs.
Programs that have an imperative in our response to the COVID-19 pandemic, as these programs have literally been lifelines for individuals and families locked out of federal relief funds for rental assistance. We are also working to continue to expand eligibility for Medicaid for undocumented older adults.
Years ago, we passed tobacco.
So the spending plan, that is still unresolved, but there has been, Paris, a whole lot of action under the Capitol dome. I'm kind of envisioning a bunch of bills like a flock of seagulls floating and flying over to Governor Pritzker's office for him to eventually take action on. So I'm going to highlight a few of them right now. One makes June 19th, that's Juneteenth, a state holiday.
And it marks the day when the federal troops arrived in Galveston, Texas in 1865 to take control of the state and ensure that all enslaved people be free. It was the time when the end of chattel slavery was done away with in this country.
Now, also passing with bipartisan backing, an extension of a law passed during the pandemic that allows establishments to serve cocktails to go. This time, though, wine also is allowed to be taken to go. And the plan also lets bars, through part of the summer anyway, give patrons a free drink if they show proof of a COVID vaccination. Now, you're going to see an exchange between Representative Keith Wheeler, who's actually on camera, with the measure's sponsor, Representative Mike Zaleski, who you can't see on cam.
Is it a shot for a shot? Is that how we're looking at it, Mike?
A shot for a shot and a beer. It's got many permutations, but it's designed to help people get vaccinated.
Well, in this case, I say let's give it a shot. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you, sir.
You hear those groans of good-natured groaning of humor there, but backers say that this is actually something that could make a serious impact.
I think this is a great initiative to really do two things that are important in our communities right now. One is to support the food and beverage industry, these restaurants and bars that were so dramatically impacted over the course of the last year and are now starting to reopen their doors to invite people back in to your local watering hole to see friends and family and neighbors get together once again. This is a great way to do that, and it also at the same time is promoting an important public health initiative of promoting vaccination.
Now, that is just a sip, a flavor, if you will, of the measures that passed. Also passing a bill that we've reported on that aims to ban schools from restricting students' hairstyles. So think afros and braids. And then you have other pieces of legislation that are still held up, like an elected school board for CPS, negotiations ongoing there. And then a plan has stalled to require mandatory fingerprinting and background checks whenever someone applies for a state gun license, a FOID or fire owner's identification card. Illinois is already very behind on issuing these FOID cards to the point that the state is facing numerous lawsuits over it. But backers say that this measure is about violence prevention. They call it the Block Illegal Ownership, or BIO bill.
You can look at your newspaper, you can turn on the news, you can ask your neighbor, you can ask children in your community. Why do we need to pass the BIO bill? Because we need to do our one job, and that is to save the lives of our children and our community members.
So some of those stalled measures, there is still time for them to quickly pass, with session carrying through Monday. One to watch out for: there is an effort to repeal an Illinois law that requires parental notification before anyone under the age of 18 can have an abortion. By the way, just before we went on air, we've been talking a lot this week about redistricting. Democrats unveiled new maps for the Illinois House and the Senate. They say they've taken into account feedback that they received yesterday and Tuesday. Haven't had the chance to look them over yet to see if that will do anything to assuage a lot of the complaints from the GOP and from a lot of community organizations. Also on the docket for this weekend, as I noted earlier, that major energy package, and we will be back later in the program with Deputy Governor Christian Mitchell to learn more about it. So for now, back to you.
Amanda, with those maps, like we talked about last night, that first pass was kind of a strategy to then come back with another version saying, hey, we listened to everybody. Anyway, thank you very much. We'll see you in just a bit.
And here it is.
There you go. All right, shifting gears, Paseo Boricua, Division Street in Humboldt Park, has been the heart and soul of Chicago's Puerto Rican community for decades. As the neighborhood eyes a recovery from COVID-19, local leaders want to ensure the people who have called Humboldt Park home for generations can stick around. As part of our Chicago Tonight In Your Neighborhood series, reporter Nick Blumberg and producer Quinn Myers spent the day in Humboldt Park. And Nick joins us now with more. Nick.
Well, Paris, if you've ever been to this part of Division, you can't miss the giant Puerto Rican flag sculptures stretching across the street. This area is also home to dozens of murals created by local artists. But for many in the arts, making a living can be tough. So to help keep them working and living in the area, a new building going up on Division will feature 24 units of affordable housing, live workspace for some of the people that helped define this neighborhood. It's been in the works for more than a decade and a half, and it's a passion project driven by Eduardo Orocho, a Humboldt Park native who says gentrification's not going to erase this community.
A project like this is going to make sure that we're going to be around for a while as a community. It's going to be an economic anchor to stimulate not only the longtime businesses here, but create new businesses and allow longtime artists to really continue to consider Paseo Boricua, Humboldt Park, their home.
The building will also feature a gallery, retail space, including a Latin wine and spirits bar, and a 99-seat theater, which will be the new home of Urban Theater Company, currently located just down the street. The theater actually celebrated its 16th anniversary yesterday. Co-founder Ivan Vega says the company's mission is to represent its community, especially for young people in the audience who might not think theater's for them at first.
If they don't see black and brown faces on stage, they cannot relate to the work. And it is uber important that we make sure that these stories are accessible. And when we have that access for our youth, we automatically grab them. And it's important, theater is transformative, and through theater we can really stay connected not only to the work, but to our community as a whole.
After a difficult year where live theater was more or less shut down, Vega's message is pretty simple.
Support your local theater, that's the most important thing. A lot of people have a misconception of what theater is, and there's theaters like ourselves who are extremely connected to community, and arts is important. So if you see theaters or local organizations in your community, support them.
Now, a short walk from the theater is the Lolita Lebron Family Learning Center, where young parents can drop off their kids so they can attend nearby Pedro Albizu Campos High School. Now, COVID's been difficult for many students, juggling remote learning, some of whom need to work to help support their families, but mentor Crystal Morales says they're still defying expectations.
Having kids at such a young age, a lot of people says that they're never going to accomplish anything. But seeing them fight for what they want and accomplish that goal, go to college, have their career, it's amazing to see that.
The Learning Center is giving away food to the students and children it serves and donating leftovers to anyone in the area who needs groceries. Down the street at the Honeycomb Network, co-founder Christina Gutierrez is also thinking about education and wellness with an eye toward inclusion. Honeycomb is a boutique apothecary and co-working space that offers things like mental health resources and workshops on herbalism.
There are a lot of spaces that are white-led and don't create safety for folks that are unpacking things around wellness. And you know, we are a co-working space, but many of the people that co-work here are working in the community, doing outreach, working on things that have challenges around them. And so the feedback that I've had consistently from people that come here, whether it's just to visit, to shop, to work, to hang art, is that they feel so safe here.
Now, Honeycomb opened in October 2020, and despite the challenges of the pandemic, Gutierrez says she's proud to say it was 100% community supported. That was the message from Eduardo Arrocho, too, who said a lot of people had to come together to make the Paseo Boricua Arts Building happen.
We don't all have J-Lo money, but you know, it took us, with a lot of determination, it took us 12 years to get the financing just to make this happen. And so it's been talked about many years, but now it's finally happened, and I think it's bringing a lot of hope to a lot of the businesses and a lot of people that come here for services, and it's making a lot of people happy.
We'll have more on how organizations in Humboldt Park are help meeting the needs of young people in the community. But Paris, for now, back to you.
All right, Nick, we'll see you in just a bit. And up next, a look at the long-anticipated Chicago Police Department foot pursuit policy. So please stay with us. Mayor Lori Lightfoot and the Chicago Police Department are out with a new interim CPD foot chase policy. Among other things, it bans officers from pursuing suspects on foot if they're suspected of a crime lower than a Class A misdemeanor. It also details tactics to avoid a foot pursuit, such as, quote, continual communication with the subject. Officers must also activate body cameras to record pursuits in full, and it prohibits foot pursuits stemming from minor traffic offenses. And joining us now with their take on this newly announced policy are Robert Boyk from the Chicago Police Department. He's the Executive Director of the Office of Constitutional Policing and Reform. Arewa Karen Winters, a co-chair of the Community Working Group that was assembled last summer to provide community input on police reform. Retired police officer Richard Wooten, founder of the nonprofit Gathering Point Community Council. And Nusrat Chowdhury, legal director at the ACLU of Illinois. Welcome all of you back to Chicago tonight. Robert Boyk, the first question I have when looking at this list of rules is it's a lot of things for officers to keep in mind. It's like a checklist they have to go through in a situation that could be heat of the moment. So how is an officer able to go through all these things when deciding whether or not to engage?
Well, the one thing this policy prioritizes is not only officer safety, but safety for the community as well. It really creates several bright lines for officers where they have to weigh the risk of engaging in the pursuit with the need to apprehend the offender. It enhances supervisor responsibilities such that officers really are taking direction on a continuous basis. And that, again, that's all designed around enhancing safety.
And Nusrat Chowdhury, this comes in the wake of the Toledo and the Anthony Alvarez shootings that came after foot pursuits. Do you think that these new rules help prevent future situations like Alvarez and Toledo?
These rules, unfortunately, don't go far enough. We know that Chicago has a problem with deadly foot pursuits, borne out by the killings that you just mentioned, but also years of data and the monitor's recent findings. What we need a policy to do is to be clear and easy to understand for officers to really grasp and implement in real time under immense pressure. And unfortunately, this policy is very long. It includes vague language, and it doesn't put up clear enough guardrails, especially with respect to prohibiting foot pursuits for minor offenses. You referred earlier to Class A misdemeanors, but there are lots of exceptions for Class B and C misdemeanors here in this policy, and it's worth underscoring that something as low as gambling, possession of alcohol by a minor, possession of drug paraphernalia, those are the kinds of offenses for which a foot pursuit would still be permitted under this policy.
All right, I want to get back to those things in a bit, but yesterday Superintendent David Brown emphasized that he felt it was important to listen to the community, and here's a little bit of what he said.
We likely will hear something that we didn't think of, and we want the benefit of hearing that from the community that we need to include in this policy. So it's worthwhile. You know, you'll never hear me say engaging the community is a bad thing, even if you think you know everything. The community needs to be engaged with every opportunity to help us build trust.
Arewa Karen Winters, do you think this policy was a result of community input?
Absolutely. And I want to say this probably started, prior to even the coalition coming forward with the consent decree, because historically this has been happening over and over and over and over, time and time again in Black and brown communities. So I definitely think it was from the people, the pressure from the people to not only have the consent decree, but to have police reform, because it is very necessary. It's very needed in this city. And this policy doesn't cut it.
So you're saying it wasn't enough input from the community, as the superintendent says he wanted to listen to the community on this. And Richard Wooten, as a former cop, I'll present this question to you. How do you go through in your head, well, is it a Class A misdemeanor or above? Is this person going to be a threat to the community? Go through this checklist in a situation that can be very heated.
Exactly. This is putting more stress on the officers, and it's also causing them to make more mistakes, because when they got to determine, when is a good time to chase and when it's not a good time to chase, it's going to put their lives even further in danger. And I think the policy should be more specific, more clear, and actually address exactly what they can chase for and when they can chase. Because, when I was going through the policy myself, it is just so... it's wishy-washy, and it also leaves out a whole lot of, it leaves room for much error.
All right. Well, Robert Bork, there are a lot of responses here I need you to respond to. So you've heard the criticism, not enough community input, it doesn't go far enough, it's too vague in its language, and that it could be dangerous for the police having to consider all these things. Your response to some of those issues?
Yeah, so I want to start with community engagement, because it's just not true to say that this policy wasn't developed with any community engagement. In fact, Ms. Winters' group met with us several weeks ago, and we talked extensively about what should be included in a foot pursuit policy. But what I would also say is that the ACLU and others really are seeking special treatment with respect to engagement. And what we've put forward is a very comprehensive plan, the most comprehensive plan that the department has ever engaged in, to get feedback not only from the community, but also from our officers, including a webinar on June 1st, 2 community meetings, one in June, one in July. The policy is open now for public comment, so we really invite public comment from everyone across the city of Chicago. And what we're really hoping to do is to have really broad community engagement and to hear from every community across the city. With respect to the policy itself, again, it prioritizes officer safety. It does create a bright line, and it creates clear responsibilities for supervisors.
And Nusrat Chowdhury, the police department mentions that this is interim. They're still studying this. They wanted to get something out really quickly in the wake of Alvarez and Toledo. What are the things that you believe should be in a permanent, more complete foot pursuit policy?
I think to underscore that, Arewa and others could have been given the chance to give input on this policy, even as developing an interim policy. So making that point clear, this is not about the ACLU, it's about people from directly impacted communities. And in terms of what the policy should actually include, this policy does not include early and a clear statement that foot pursuits are extraordinarily dangerous. We know this city has a problem with deadly foot pursuits, and that is not made clear in the purpose of the policy or throughout it. But what we get instead are, as others have mentioned, wishy-washy statements that leave a lot of room for officer discretion to engage in a foot pursuit, even when there are minor offenses, even in the categories of offenses that are identified in the foot pursuit. And that is not the kind of clear, easy to operationalize guidance that's going to restrict what has been a deadly practice in the city of Chicago for a very long time.
And Arewa Karen Winters, community groups did suggest dozens of recommendations. Many of them did not make it in here. What do you believe should make it into this policy that was left out?
I just want to say I appreciate Deputy Superintendent Boyd, but no, I can't say honestly that we had an extensive conversation. Initially, they did introduce some of their concepts to us, but we didn't have like we didn't receive anything written, so we really didn't have a chance to process and go through to even, wholeheartedly make recommendations. But in 2019, the coalition did submit some things, but what I'm more concerned about is the prohibitions. It's like I didn't see any prohibitions listed. And one of them, for me, is so many of our young people are shot in their backs while they're running away, while they're fleeing. They say that they're a threat to the community, but really at that instant, they're only a threat to themselves. So how can police officers engage the threat without killing them, without, harming them? And so that's when I think of serve and protect. It's like, even in the worst case scenarios, whether they have a weapon, not have a weapon, if they're not openly shooting at anyone, which in most cases they're not, they're running away. Most of them are climbing fences and they lose their lives. So I want to see our police department engage with our especially our young people in our communities, where everyone can come out safe.
Richard Wooten,
so that is one of the things I want to see, the prohibitions.
I see. Richard Wooten, how do police officers feel about foot pursuits in general? I mean, do they feel that they carry a whole lot of risk and danger with them? Would they rather not engage in a foot pursuit, or would they rather be able to engage that way?
Well, let me say this here. Foot pursuits is part of the job, and we understand that. In August 19, 2001, we lost a great officer that worked with me in the Inglewood District, Eric Lee, from a foot pursuit, who was actually shot by an offender. But we need to understand that foot pursuits sometimes it's not necessary. When you have gambling, in the Black and brown communities, these are most of your foot pursuits come from: gambling, suspended driver's license, drinking on a public way, or some other minor incident where the individual is going to return back around in that area again, the next day. So why pursue them when they're already going to be there? But what happens when an officer actually see these particular crimes in this act, they begin to their adrenaline level kicks in, and then they go running. What we need is a statement within a policy that says we will not chase anyone unless it's life-threatening and is a Class A, not Class A, but a felony. Other than that, it should not be any foot pursuits, because you put the officer at danger, you put the community at danger, and you also put this individual that's running at danger because they don't want to be called by the police.
All right, and as the policy mentions, there is more to come on this. They're going to have a community review process and then come out with more specific proposals in September, and we'll have to leave it here for now. Our thanks to Arroyo Karen Winters, Nusrat Chowdhury, Richard Wooten, and Robert Boyk. Thanks all for joining us.
Thank you.
And now we check back in with Nick Blungberg, who's live out in Humboldt Park as part of our Chicago Tonight in Your Neighborhood series. Nick.
That's right, Paris. I'm here with Dr. Melissa Lewis, principal of Pedro Albizu Campos High School and a member of the Puerto Rican Agenda's Education Committee. Thanks for joining us out here. We appreciate it. Everybody's been dealing with remote learning in one way or another in the education setting over the past 14 months or so, but not everybody has the same access or the same resources. How's that played out for some of the students you work with?
Some of the students that we work with at Dr. Pedro Albizu Campos High School are really struggling right now. They're having to really understand how do they balance being students, being full-time students, but also having to work full-time, having to really sustain their families. That's something that we don't normally talk about. What does the working scholar have to do in a pandemic to sustain their families? We're not really discussing that right now.
And I would imagine there's an element of stress, of mental health support that's needed there, balancing so much. Is that something that you've seen?
Yeah, wraparound supports are definitely needed. We need mobile health clinics that are in the communities that are able to really address the needs of our students. There's so much going on right now, and that fear is ever present in our young people's lives, and we need to address it.
Is that the kind of thing that sometimes goes unaddressed, that maybe it's one of those unspoken things, but you kind of need to bring out and to confront?
Right. I think that young people right now are dealing with a lot. There's a lot of anxiety, a lot of fear, and they tend to be strong and they're going to be resilient, but they need to talk about their feelings, and we need to model what does that look like when adults around us can really be honest about what's going on and what we're feeling right now, because educators are fearful too right now in this time. We need to model what does that look like and how do you have honest conversation.
So as vaccination rates start to go up and COVID cases going down, deaths going down, thankfully, Are you hopeful that you can have a return to a more normal in-person learning model?
You know, for me, I'm hopeful that I'm able to meet the needs of my students. If my students need to be in person because 5 days works for them and that's what they need, then I want to do that. But if a young person has to choose between working 30, 35 hours a week and school, I don't want to have to make that choice for them. I want to be flexible. I want to make sure that there are options. I don't want to have to force a student's choice.
So as we're heading into the time of year where Chicago unfortunately tends to see an increase in violence, as an educator, what's on your mind in terms of making sure your students stay safe in the warmer months?
While I understand that my young people have been forced to enter the workforce and really work right now, I am so thankful that they are. You know, the vast majority of my young people are working 35 hours a week. And if you're working, you're not on the streets. You're going to be safe. You're going to be able to be in a space that sustains you and your family. And I need to really support that and really honor that experience. You know, so for me, you know, in this past year, we've lost a handful of young people. And I don't know how much more we can endure as a school, as a community.
We've got about 20 seconds left or so. Are there some specific resources or needs that you think the Humboldt Park community really needs in terms of support for COVID recovery?
I think that I need to uplift the work of the Puerto Rican agenda. You know, having a community, a collective of organizations and individuals that are really pushing the policies that come from within a community is key. You know, we all understand what community is facing, and we understand as a community what we need, and the Puerto Rican agenda really does that well.
All right. Well, Melissa Lewis, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
And Paris, back to you in the studio.
All right, Nick, thank you very much. And still to come on Chicago Tonight, Illinois' energy future. We're live with the Deputy Governor to talk about negotiating a bill that could impact what you pay for electricity.
I first came to Chicago when I was 21 years old to sing at Mr. Kelly's.
Familiar voice there. A documentary delves into an iconic Chicago performance venue, and we guarantee you're going to recognize some of the famous artists who performed there. And Jeffrey Bayer quizzes us on our knowledge of a Chicago landmark that's being partially restored in this week's Ask Jeffrey. But first, some more of today's top stories. Mayor Lori Lightfoot says she has a new compromise plan for those who want to honor Chicago's first non-Indigenous settler, Jean-Baptiste Point du Sable. This comes one day after an ordinance to rename Lakeshore Drive Du Sable Drive got punted until the next meeting. The mayor is proposing an annual Du Sable Festival to be held in August. This in addition to a promise to name the Riverwalk after him and spur on a $40 million public-private plan to finally complete Du Sable Park. That's a little slice of land just north of the Chicago River on Lake Michigan. Aldermen in support of the Lakeshore Drive name change have been chilly to the mayor's counter-proposals to this point. And state public health officials report more than 800 new COVID-19 cases in the last 24 hours with 42 additional deaths. That makes for a statewide total of 1.379 million cases and 22,718 deaths. The 7-day test positivity rate right now is down to 2.5%. And how about this? This is such an incredible and improbable baseball play. We had to talk about it in case you haven't seen it yet. Check out Cubs slugger Javi Baez grounds the third with 2 outs in the top of the first. Well, he decides to get in a rundown between home and first when all the Pittsburgh first baseman had to do is step on the bag and the inning's over. So here you go. It causes a run to score. Cubs go up 2-0, and then an error. Baez takes second. Amazing. And Cubs went on to win this game by a final of 5-3. Just when you thought you'd seen it all in baseball, El Mago strikes again. And Amanda Vinicky strikes again in Springfield. Amanda, what do you have?
Hey, Ferris, I'm joined now by one of Governor J.B. Pritzker's deputy governors, and that is Christian Mitchell. He actually previously served as a member of the Illinois House. Speaking with you because you are the lead negotiator on this major energy package. This is complicated stuff, but give me a rundown. I'm told that after a whole lot of meetings, we're beginning to see a framework. What's in it?
Absolutely. First of all, thanks for having me. Look, the governor put forward principles many, many months ago on energy, and we believe that a final package is going to and needs to track those principles. We want to lead with ethics. We want to make sure that we are doubling our commitment to renewable energy, but also preserving our nuclear fleet. We want to make sure that we're taking major steps forward on decarbonization, phasing out coal and gas in the next 2 decades, getting to 100% zero-emission power by 2050, and making Illinois the best place in the world to make, manufacture, drive, and electric vehicles. vehicle. We think this package can and should do that, and we'll also make sure we end some of the things like formula rates that got some folks in trouble in recent years.
Got some folks in trouble talking about that corruption scandal, ComEd admitting to a long-running bribery scheme. Now, a part of that, however, ComEd's parent company, Exelon, is asking for something like $500 million from ratepayers. They say it's needed. Otherwise, they are going to close a pair of nuclear plants. That would mean losing jobs and also hurting Illinois' attempts to reach those clean energy goals. So, how much appetite is there for it, given the corruption that we've just mentioned, to give Exelon more money, and what sort of figure is appropriate for ratepayers to be giving over to?
Yeah, well, first of all, this is why the governor took a very different approach that's been taken before. So we did an independent audit that looked at their finances, said, do these guys need help? Do they not? Turns out those two plants do need some help. The right question is, what is the right deal for taxpayers? How do you make sure you right-size that? Because the governor believes in preserving the nuclear fleet, but at the lowest possible cost to ratepayers. So negotiations have centered around what does that look like? How long is that period of help? And we believe that we think we can still get there in these next couple of days, because I think reality is sinking in for folks that there isn't a ton of appetite to pay more than we need to for these plants.
What might that look like for an individual ratepayer? What could they see tacked onto their bill? Or what else would they be getting out of this?
Well, look, nuclear power is roughly 54% of our power in the state of Illinois. I think it's more than 60% of our clean power. We need to preserve these fleets, preserve these good union jobs. The governor is committed to that. What you're looking at is probably just a few cents on a bill, but what we want to make sure of, given everything that's happened in COVID and how people are hurting right now, that we are doing as little as possible to make sure that we are, yes, preserving these jobs, but not hurting the average ratepayer. That's the governor's principle, and the legislature agrees on that.
And then we also have 50 Democratic legislators signing on just this week to a letter saying that unless there is a set date for Illinois to go carbon-free, they aren't going to be for any package. You mentioned something about this. What might that date be? Will that be part of this plan?
Well, the governor's proposed phasing out coal by 2030, natural gas by 2045. We're having conversation with the legislature about that, 100% clean power by 2050, but the governor has said he's not going to sign a bill that doesn't do significant steps on climate change, significantly decarbonize our electric sector. So we believe that, and frankly, it's not going to get to his desk if 50 people are saying they're not going to vote without it.
Exactly. Once again, thank you so very much for joining us. I know this is complicated stuff, but we, of course, will have the latest on it as things shape up. Thanks again to Deputy Governor Christian Mitchell. Back to you guys.
Yeah, Amanda, these energy bills always tend to be so complex with so many prongs. We'll see how it makes it down to the wire. Only a few days to go. And now we check back in with Nick Blumberg, who spent the day in Humboldt Park as part of our Chicago Tonight in Your Neighborhood series. Nick.
Paris, earlier today we spoke with Talina Carter, Director of Early Childhood Education for Chicago Youth Centers, which offers programming for kids under the age of 5 at its facility just west of here. I began by asking her about the lingering impact of the pandemic on the kids she works with.
Most of our work we've done pre-pandemic has been very much social-emotional focused, working on children in terms of their relationships with each other, and so to now shift that. And so now we're separating them and separating toys and separating their friends and wearing masks. And most of our work is contingent on being able to communicate with the children and get a sense of how they feel and read their emotions. And so, you know, having to wear the mask and just shift to that and then shift to virtual. We've worked to shift for most part of this year, shift our programs to virtual platforms so that we can really meet the needs of our families and get resources out to them. Most recently with returning back to in-person, it was really making our facilities and preparing them for the children. So individualizing their materials and really working to still meet the needs to them, but in a different environment, and so with a different focus. And so I think the children have been so resilient, and they wear masks better than adults. And what we wanted to continue to make sure that we tapped into that social and emotional development of our staff, of our teachers, because it's really, most of them have families that they're trying to take care of, teach virtual as well as teach their children. And so just shifting to meet all of those needs while we want to maintain enrollment and funding. Some of our enrollment dropped because the families were not ready to come back, and it's a matter of ensuring them some of the protocols we put in place, safety protocols, you know, how we receive children, you know, distancing outside. Our families are not coming back into the classroom at this moment, and so making sure we keep that communication with the parents as well, of letting them know how their children's day go.
And how challenging can that be, focusing on that social and emotional learning, mental health, sort of in-person interactions, all those different things when you're in more of a virtual environment or even a socially distanced, masked environment?
And that is when you think about touch. And, we're picking up children, we're embracing them when they come in. Hey, good morning, and giving them those embraces. And so really figuring out a way to do those distantly. As a way also to keep the families engaged virtually. And so having, meeting those needs, or if a parent was working, a non-traditional shift, then we have to figure out how to meet that need and have a story time at maybe 6 o'clock instead of 3 o'clock.
And I know we're all hopeful for the recovery in the coming months. What are you going to be looking for? What do the young folks that you work with here need for that recovery?
I think just a sense that the teachers feel great about that recovery and coming back and welcoming them, and then that we're still here. We're still here to serve families, provide those intentional early childhood experiences in an early learning environment that's safe for all.
And Talina Carter says she knows some parents might still be hesitant to send their children back, but that at Chicago Youth Centers, they're doing everything they can to keep kids safe and keep their development on track. That's all for us from Humboldt Park. Paris, back to you.
Thanks, Nick. Barbra Streisand, Oscar Peterson, Richard Pryor, Dick Gregory. If you were a performer and you played Mr. Kelly's on Rush Street, you knew you were on your way. A documentary airing tonight on WTTW shares the history of the iconic performance venue that launched so many careers. Live at Mr. Kelly's tells the story of the legendary nightclub, a place that put Chicago on the map and helped define American culture through jazz and sometimes subversive comedy performances and so much more.
In my mind, there are two uniquely American art forms, jazz and stand-up comedy. And Mr. Kelly's was essentially an incubator for both.
Many of the most talented and famous recording artists in the history of popular music, including Ella Fitzgerald, Billie Holiday, Sarah Vaughan, Della Reese, and Anita O'Day, record live at Mr. Kelly's.
A familiar voice narrating there, and joining us is the film's executive producer, David Marienthal. His father, George, and Uncle Oscar owned and operated Mr. Kelly's, as well as the performance venues, the London House and Happy Medium. David Marienthal, welcome to Chicago Tonight.
It's so nice to speak with you, Paris, and I'm glad you're a big fan of this era.
Absolutely, and we look forward to the documentary just after this show. So for those, like myself, not fortunate to be around to get to go to Mr. Kelly's or the London House, remind viewers the kind of reputations they had, not only in Chicago, but across the country.
Well, they were known as the tastemakers to the nation. And they literally curated the best up-and-coming talent from around the nation and brought it to Chicago, and gave these stars a place to really hone their careers.
And, we mentioned the names at the top, and you add in people like Bob Newhart or Steve Martin. Was it just that your father and uncle had their finger on the pulse of who was up and coming, and that's how it developed this reputation, Mr. Kelly's specifically, as this place to catch the hot acts?
Well, starting in 1953 when it opened, my Uncle Oscar really had an eye for talent. He was in and out of New York and L.A., and he brought people like Streisand and the Smothers Brothers out of the coffee houses of New York City and brought them into Chicago. And for years, he had this vision of a singer and a stand-up comic, and he, was not shy to bring in, as you say, controversial, groundbreaking acts.
And as we mentioned, putting Chicago on the map, and a lot of artists like Sarah Vaughan, you saw that they loved the atmosphere at Mr. Kelly's so much that when they cut their live albums, they cut it there. So tell us about the atmosphere at Mr. Kelly's. What was that like?
Well, You're correct that these were obviously established stars, Sarah Vaughan, Ella Fitzgerald, Billie Holiday, that came into Kelly's. And you have to remember that these stars were playing 10 shows a week, 2 on the week and 3 on weekends, up to 2, 3 in the morning. And they'd stay for 2 and 3 weeks. So it was an amazing venue. It was a very intimate spot. Eartha Kitt talks about in her interview with Studs Terkel that it was almost like you were part of the audience when you were performing there. And they had great food. That was something that Chicagoans required. The best steaks, the best fish, and my father really took care of making that right and making sure that the customers were treated right, and the staff. They were very good to their staff of all kinds and all colors.
Well, I think
they had employees that stayed with them for years.
The slogan at the London House was "Make a date with a steak" or something like that. And you mentioned that your father and uncle didn't shy away from controversial subjects. Let's listen to Chicago-born legendary comedian Dick Gregory on why he loved playing Mr. Kelly's.
Were there African Americans in the audience as well?
Where?
At the Kellys.
Oh, yeah, Kelly's. No place else. No place else. That was one of the safe places we knew we could go.
So they're bringing in African-American artists, Latino artists, male, female, and the crowd. You hear Dick Gregory saying African-Americans feel that's a safe place for them to go, one of the few safe places, an integrated place. Was that important to the Marienthals to cultivate a place like that in controversial times?
Well, I never heard them preach it as such, but my father told me, he had thought there was only one rule, and that was the goal, and that you should, treat people fairly. And, obviously that didn't restrict people of any color. And so, they certainly were forward thinking, but it was a sign of the times. They were, one of a few clubs in Chicago that we have the article from the Chicago Defender that says they, these venues now welcoming the sepia trade, it was called. And, so there was, along with professional sports, things were opening up. But the Marienthal brothers made it sure that, people felt welcome. We have a great story about Ernie Banks sitting down in the restaurant, and a white couple next to him got up and walked out, and my cousin, who was working there at the time, sat down and had dinner with Ernie. So they made sure that everybody felt good.
And it wasn't just that, but also comedians, comics around the 60s start to really stretch the limits here of what's appropriate, especially as we get into the late 60s and things get really turbulent. How come your father and uncle were cool with that? I mean, they didn't shy away from comics that would come in and sort of test out the really controversial material.
Well, it was a combination of willing to push the boundaries, and they were running a business as well. It was a very interesting times, because they could have not only was the crowd integrated, but it was business people, conventioneers that were coming in, families from the suburbs, as well as the hip crowd, the beatniks of the time. And so it was a real mix, and people were willing to get together and share. And watching somebody like the Smothers entertain at the same time promote free speech and anti-war, and I think that it was the common ground, is that this was entertainment. People were laughing, and so you could, Dick Gregory does tell jokes, which I don't know if you can get away with today or not, about slum clearance, about segregation, and people were laughing.
And
that's what really brought them together.
And then you had acts like Tim Reed and Tom Dreesen from Harvey, who they were a black and white act. What about you? I mean, you were young when it was still around. Do you have any memories of favorite acts that you saw at Mr. Kelly's?
Well, I have a lot of great memories, and this film is really a combination of the social movements that you're talking about, the great entertainers that got their start, and somewhat of my personal and the brothers' family. And our editor, Scott Dumler, and director, Teddy Bosian, were able to interweave these stories in, I feel, a very engaging way. And so, as a kid, I would go in and, my favorite acts were fun, ones that were fun. I loved Les McCann, who was a jazz pianist, but when my father would entertain all the entertainers, and Les would come in the back and play with myself and my brothers. The Smothers Brothers would, just goof around with us and be funny. Of course, I was, blown away when I saw Barbra Streisand at 12 years old, who walks up as, really a kid not that much older than I was, and she opens her mouth, and you knew you were in the presence of genius.
And you actually opened the film with voiceover from Barbra Streisand talking about how important Mr. Kelly's was to her, and then she went and did a photo shoot on Oak Street Beach, which became the cover of her famous album People. So there's so many great stories, and wish we could tell them all in Chicago tonight, but viewers are going to get to watch the whole thing in just a bit. And our thanks right now to David Marienthal. Thank you so much.
Well, there's a lot of great stories on our website at www.mrkellyschicago.com, and the film will be shown several times this weekend and then released nationally in the fall. It's a full-length version. All
right, well, congratulations on that. And Live at Mr. Kelly's airs tonight at 8, right here on WTTW, as we mentioned. Up next, a special pre-Memorial Day encore presentation of Ask Jeffrey. But first, we take a look at the weather.
Chicago Tonight is made possible in part through the generous support of the Julius Frankel Foundation.
A piece of Civil War history is being restored in one of Chicago's most well-known public buildings. But what was it doing there in the first place? Our own Jeffrey Bayer has the answer in this week's Ask Jeffrey, or does he? Hey, Jeffrey, how's it going?
Great, Paris. How are you?
There was some mysteriousness there with the way I asked that question. All right, our letter is from Elizabeth Neal from Elmhurst. She says, I heard that the GAR section of the Chicago Cultural Center is being restored. What's the story of why the GAR had claim to space in the building in the first place?
Okay, well, I thought we'd start off a little differently this week, Paris. I'm going to ask you a quiz question
I knew something
on
was
this
up.
subject. Yes, this is up, and I'm going to make it a little easier for you because we're going to give you a multiple choices here. And actually, your lead-in kind of gave away the answer, but let's see what we've got here. So, what does GAR stand for? Does it stand for Gentleman Authors Room? B, Grand Army of the Republic, C, Garfield, Adams, and Roosevelt, or D, the General Archive and Repository?
Well, since we mentioned the Civil War in the lead, and you said that kind of gave it away, I'm going to have to go with Grand Army of the Republic.
Ding, ding, ding. You are correct. It stands for Grand Army of the Republic. So the GAR was essentially a fraternal organization and social club for veterans of the Civil War on the Union side. It was established. There were hundreds of chapters actually established across the country in the second half of the 19th century. The group had regular meetings and even held parades. I love this picture. Look at the guy hanging off the roof there, commemorating their time in the service. In some ways, it was kind of like a proto-VFW. The GAR also had an annual nationwide meeting known as the National Encampment, and in 1900 it was held right here in Chicago. And you'll notice in the top left corner of this poster, a building that might look familiar to you, labeled Memorial Hall GAR. Do you know what that building is?
Well, Jeffrey, since we mentioned in the letter the Cultural Center, I'm going to say that's the Chicago Cultural Center, which I think was the first Chicago Public Library, but you might correct me on that.
You know your history. That's right. It is what we now call the Cultural Center, located prominently on Michigan Avenue across from Millennium Park, but it was originally the Chicago Public Library.
All right, so how did the GAR, the Grand Army of the Republic, manage to score space at the library?
Right. Well, actually, we might ask, how did the library manage to score space in the GAR Hall? Because in the late 1800s, when the city was looking for a site to build a central library, they decided on what seemed at the time to be the perfect location on Michigan Avenue, but there was a catch. Portions of the land were owned by, you guessed it, the GAR, which hoped to use it as a Civil War memorial. The land had been given to Civil War veterans groups by the state of Illinois legislature. So the city got a compromise, and parts of the northern section of the building became the GAR's Chicago headquarters, where they held meetings and also hosted an exhibition of Civil War memorabilia in glass cases. Today, the space is used for all kinds of private functions and public events, including the Chicago Architecture Biennial, seen here in 2019. And as our questioner mentions, the GAR rooms are undergoing an extensive restoration project. This includes refurbishing the dome, this beautiful dome outside the GAR Memorial Hall and kind of the rotunda there, designed by the building's architect, Charles Coolidge, along with Louis Comfort Tiffany, and fabricated by the renowned local art glass company, Healy and Millay. And this is, by the way, not to be confused with the more famous Tiffany glass dome in that same building at the southern end, which was magnificently restored a few years ago. The project is also restoring many of the more than century-old surfaces and walls in the GAR Memorial Hall, ornamented with symbols of war from throughout history.
All right, thank you, Jeffrey. And don't forget that you can visit our website for more details about the history of the GAR. And while you're there, don't forget to submit your own question to Jeffrey Bayer. That's at WTTW.com/AskJeffrey. And we're back to wrap things up right after this. Great programming coming up, and that's our show for this Thursday night. Don't forget to stay connected with us by signing up for our daily briefing, and you can get Chicago Tonight streamed on Facebook, YouTube, and our website, WTTW.com/news. And, of course, you get the show on podcast and the PBS video app as well. And please join us tomorrow night at 7 for the Weekend Review. And now for all of us here at Chicago Tonight, I'm Paris Schutz. Thank you so much for watching. Stay healthy and safe and warm, and have a great night.
Closed captioning for this program is made possible by Robert A. Clifford and Clifford Law Offices, pleased to give back to the community through numerous charitable initiatives.
At Mr. Kelly's nightclub in Chicago,